Welcome to another episode of Rapidly Aging Tech, where today we're going to be looking at the mighty beast, the PowerMac G5 Quad. This is my active duty editing machine, and we're going to take a look at the insides. We're going to maybe play around with editing on it a bit, and we'll talk about why it became my editing machine as opposed to, say, my current main machine, which is running a far more powerful processor setup, an AMD FX 9590, more powerful graphics card, faster RAM, all sorts of stuff. Why did this machine become my editing rig? So we'll look at that, we'll look at the machine itself, and we'll see how it goes. This is going to be the beginning of, I think, a 3-video series, not on the PowerMac itself, but leading up to a very special machine I got, which I think has a lot of similarities with the PowerMac itself. The PowerMac G5 first entered onto the scene in 2003 or 2004, where the top of the line machine had 2 single-core processors running at 2 gigahertz. And visually, they look, from at least the front, they all look pretty well identical, whether you got a single CPU or a dual CPU version. At that introduction Apple conference with Steve Jobs and whatnot, the PowerMac was compared to a couple Pentium 4 systems at the time, and with the tests came out on top for the most part, being fairly favorable with the spec in it tests. Now, that was at 2 gigahertz and 2 single-core processors. This is the PowerMac G5 Quad. It has 2 dual-core processors, and instead of running at 2 gigahertz, they're running at 2.5 gigahertz. They have 1 megabyte of level 2 cache per core, and they are certainly quite hot. And if you haven't looked into the PowerMac G5, you'll see that every single design aspect into this machine is built around airflow and keeping things cool. In my opinion, this is one of those machines that even if you are very much not an Apple fan, it's just such a nice looking machine that you really want it. And that's why I ended up having it. So let's take a look at the front here. So as you can see, it's not a fake grill. This is a real mesh grill. Air can go through all these holes. It's not just there's not like black plastic behind here. This is the optical drive cover. When I first got this machine, I thought that, well, maybe there must be a way to make it open, right? Because there's no visible button. Maybe if I just press on the thing, it'll go through. No, Macs use a button on the keyboard. I didn't know, but it actually slides down, and I want to say, if I try hard enough, I think I make it slip down, but that's about it. There's a little mark where I think there was a label here once from the previous owner. I think this might have been in a school or some sort of work environment. Going down, we'll see it has fairly simple front I/O. So we have the power button, which isn't, a pretty clean, nice, sharp-looking button, a headphone jack, a USB 2.0 port, and a FireWire 400 port. Remember, this is back in the day when the first, I think, 1 or 2 generations of iPods were FireWire devices. So FireWire 400 on the front makes sense. Plus, Apple was pushing FireWire. FireWire is good, and I kind of wish we had just, instead of going full Thunderbolt where it has all these other features, I'm just a fan of a simple, quick data bus type of thing. But, I'm a fuddy-duddy. You'll also notice that the machine has handles on top, and it has feet that look the same, so it has a symmetrical look. Steve Jobs commented that the professional environments really were fans of the handles, and I will say that carrying this machine, I do appreciate the handles as well. If you've ever wondered how large this machine is, Sometimes the video footage can be fairly deceptive. It is it's a stout machine, but it doesn't seem really all that much different from a traditional mid-tower. And a mid-tower computer is pretty big by today's standards anyway. So don't think of it as a giant. I actually expected it to be much bigger when it showed up. It's a pretty reasonable size. I can't really complain. You'll notice on the side here, we have this Apple logo right in the side. I guess it'd be not embossed, but not even, I don't know, it seems painted. It seems almost brushed differently. So this whole thing kind of is a smooth aluminum, almost brushed aluminum, and the Apple logo is just different texture on there. So a lot of craftsmanship went in here. They are very good looking machines. On the top here, I left these on to show you, are a few accessories that I've come to use. So this is a 1 terabyte external hard drive. It is the OWC Mercury Elite Pro series. OWC Otherworld Computing is a website dedicated to Mac parts and whatnot. And there's the back. This is connected using FireWire 800. Of course, it also supports USB 3.0 on later devices, and it works in Windows 2. Oh, and eSATA as well. Of course, you have to use a Windows-friendly file system. Here's the front. You'll notice that it looks very much like it was built to match this machine. Probably because it was built to match the later Mac Pro, which looks visually very similar to the Power Mac G5. Here's another look at the rear I/O again if you want. There's a Kensington lock, eSATA, power switch, USB 3.0 W Type B connector, and then FireWire 800. Remember, FireWire, it can daisy chain, so that's why there's 2 ports. So you can link up to a silly number of devices all in one line, as long as they're powered. As far as bus powered goes, you're a little more limited. On top here, we have our card reader, which is still plugged in. I use it for the SD slot, because that's what this camera uses, but there's of course compact flash and whatnot. And then an iOmega floppy drive. Here's the floppy drive in case you're interested. It's a simple drive, nothing too crazy on it. Little rubber feet here. And it's not a non-detachable cable. It seems well built enough. Works pretty decently with Mac OS. I had another external floppy that it wasn't a fan of. You'd eject and whatnot, and it would kind of throw a fit, not want to read the next disk, and you have to fully unplug and then plug back in the whole drive. Not the best. And here is the card reader. It is technically USB 3.0, but of course I don't have anything. Power Mac G5s can't use USB 3.0 because the final operating system, Leopard 10.5.8, does not support it. So, and I'm going to talk about that because of a certain expansion card I was looking at. Starting at the lower end of the back of the machine, we see the power plug. As you can tell, this isn't a standard PC power plug. This one is more common in server applications. Here is the cable in question that plugs into the back. It's a very flexible rubber that Apple used at least back then on a number of different cables. It's very solid, very secure. It moves very nicely. Here is the connector, and it goes flush to the machine with this point. This odd-looking connector, it has to do with my complicated KVM switch setup. So this is a single link, sadly enough, DVI connector, which also has microphone, speaker, and USB linked into it. You see, once you plug all these things in, this cable actually terminates in the form of a double-headed HDMI connector, because there's another one of these connected to my Mac Mini, and that goes into the switch. It's so that the switch can have speakers, microphone, mouse and keyboard hooked up, and have and then connect to the machines properly. So that's that, and the Ethernet cable. Going up from the more bottom of the rear, we have the I/O well, not really shield, because it's built right into the case, but going up we have 3 USB 2.0 ports. We have speaker out and line in. We have optical audio in and out, which is interesting. We have Firewire 400, Firewire 800, and dual gigabit Ethernet. Now, you may find that this I/O is a bit lacking, and I did too. Primarily because the standard I/O of USB 2.0 is very low. There's only 3 of them. Now, do keep in mind that most Apple keyboards, I think pretty much all of them, do have a pass-through for the mouse, so the mouse and keyboard only take up 1. But let's talk about an older type I/O shield in the PC world that's been around for a long time. And you'll notice how it starts to seem a little sparse. So here is a fairly traditional, generic ATX backplate that I had. And if we look on it, we have mouse and keyboard PS2 ports, which, alright, so 2 of those, that gets your usual interface devices. The PowerMac G5 only needs 1 USB port to do that because of the hub in the keyboard. So okay, that's fine, at least 2 USB for the PowerMac. Here you would probably have Ethernet and 2 USB ports. Alright, so that's not too bad. Then here we have, you have your parallel and your 2 serial ports, and these can link up to multiple devices. Your printer's probably going to be on the printer port. Serial, you could have scanners or whatnot. Okay, so that's pretty decent. Then for the sound portion, if the motherboard had sound, you'd have your game port, so your joystick, which otherwise would be another USB port, could be there, and your audio in and out. If you don't forego the game port and put the sound ports more at the bottom, you could probably fit another 2 USB ports. So compared to machines of the time that this thing was facing, the I/O can feel a little constricted unless you have a number of devices that are the Firewire versions of them. Otherwise, 3 USB can feel a little tight on the back. Luckily, I tried to solve that. So here we have, well, first the graphics card, which we'll see when we open up, but I have up at the top, a Firewire 400 and USB card, gives me 3 more USB ports. And then there's a Firewire 800 card. The Firewire 800 card, both these cards are Sonnet brand cards. There used to be the equivalent of this upper card in Firewire 800. And you can actually still find it on eBay. I even tried ordering one recently, and they accidentally sent me the wrong one. They sent me another Firewire 400 version, so right now I'm working with them to get the right one corrected. It'll probably end up working out. But the reason I bring it up is because after a while, Sonnet decided to discontinue the USB 2.0 version of the 800 card and release a USB 3.0 version, which is great. I mean, no complaints, except for these old Power Macs they don't support USB 3.0, so you have to find the older version. Here we have the 2 exhaust ports. These look a bit bigger than 80 millimeters, maybe 90. And I'll shine my light in here. You can see the fan blades, and if you look right there, you'll see some heat sinking. So when we actually look inside this machine, you will see at least the front of a very impressive heat system, or cooling system rather, but you're not going to be able to see back this far because there is a plate. Behind the heat sink system and whatnot, there are, on each processor card, there is a heat pipe that curls up and has a heat sink on the top of it that lines up with the rest of the heat sinking. I think it goes over the VRM system on each processor card, and so that's what that thing we saw past the blades was. This piece here if I remember correctly, this is where the wireless antenna cables go. So I think this is sort of an antenna out the back. Here we have the latch, which opens up the side panel, and a Kensington lock. So let's see, hopefully this thing doesn't fall open. Oh, I mentioned that this thing was probably in a school or some sort of studio or whatnot. This is just another indicator of that, some number code on the back. If we pull up this lever, which is nice and smooth for the most part, you will see something there. Well, we can pop that down. We close back up. We have now a lock there. So you can't. So not only does it secure the case, well, secure it for someone who's not really trying too hard to seal it, but also makes it so that if there was a lock on here, you wouldn't be able to open the side panel up. All right, the camera's probably gonna have a hard time focusing because this Apple logo is a bit hard to see, especially with the glare. But now we're gonna open up the machine. It's the moment you've all been waiting for, and it is quite impressive inside. So all you do is lift the latch, and then the side panel rolls down like that. Now, isn't that pretty in there? That's the thing about this machine. It looks good on the inside and the outside. When the panel lowers out, so this would be the top of the case, so you pull it out down, it actually gives you instructions that are engraved in here. You can feel them on removing some components and whatnot, which is nice and handy. You'll also see gasket material around this part that's jutting in a bit. Try to keep airflow only going through the right places. The thickness of the metal, it is quite thick and very sturdy. It feels like a very premium device, and by all means it should be. It's an advanced workstation. If you wondered how the latch mechanism worked for the side panel, it's a simple. Let me switch hands here. When you move the lever, these little hooks, when you lift up, retract, allowing the side panel to come off. The side panel has little grooves in here where those hooks connect into. Down on the bottom we do have some serial number information, but nothing too worthwhile. The thing you're going to notice the most probably is this plastic acrylic thing here. What is it? What's the point of that? Well, it definitely lines up with the case itself, and there's a good reason for this. It makes more sense on the older models. You see, when this machine was, the early models of this machine were introduced, this assembly here, there was more of a gap between it and this fan system here. And in fact, I think this fan had less of a shroud with it. So this air guide is what it is. Did a very good job of guiding the air once it was past the fans, keeping it pushing towards the heat sinks. Well, as these machines got more powerful and hotter, this lower compartment more or less takes care of itself. The upper compartment here still uses some help. So I'm going to explain that with the acrylic off so we don't have to look at the glare. And in case you're wondering how you do that, there's this little handle here. Just pops right out. So this upper section here is the expansion slot section. Here we have the NVIDIA Quadro FX 4500. It's a 512 megabyte VRAM card. It has one of those large, I almost want to say like sunflower coolers, but it's really not. It just has a central fan and heat sinks going into, and heat pipes going into heat sinks. We have, of course, our expansion cards up there. All the slots, if I remember right, all the slots are 16x in length, though not necessarily 16x in data. Of course, the bottom one is. And this card requires a 6-pin power adapter, which is supplied by a mini header on the motherboard. You'll see this large heat sink here, going over various chipsets and whatnot. And this guy right here, past the expansion slot support for extra long cards is a fan. Now with that air guide dipping into here, it ensures that the air from that fan pushes over the heat sink and over whatever cards are here until it goes out the mesh on the back. A pretty impressive system. And it's really simple. It's just a little plastic sheet that folds into here. You'll also notice, if you didn't see it beforehand, how compartmentalized this machine is. This lower CPU section also has the RAM. There's more chipsets down there. 16 gigs of DDR2 running at 533 megahertz, which is the most this machine can take. When it came from the original seller, it had 4 gigs of faster RAM, but since it wasn't the right speed and Mac seemed to be a little picky, it was running at 400 megahertz. So this is the expansion card slot bay with its own cooling. And then the upper bay is the spinning storage section, which, looky there, has its own fan. So air will be pulled over the CD drive. It's a CD DVD burner. It's a super drive, which is really just a badged like Sony drive, but they're decent. So we got a fan here blowing over the 2 hard drive bays. One weakness of this machine as far as professionals go is that its internal drive storage is a bit limited, in that you can only have 2. Unless, I think there were a couple aftermarket adapters to cram another one in here, but that's neither here nor there. My machine is running a 2 terabyte Western Digital Black drive as the boot drive, and a 4 terabyte Seagate Constellation drive for storage and scratch disk. They both run at 7,200 RPM. Now behind this fan, which has collected some dust after being used, is a round thing. You can see that. That's actually one of those squirrel cage fans. And what it does, and I'll try to insert some pictures because there's no way I'm getting out the back of this thing. This case is sealed up. On this end of the motherboard, you can see there's a gap. Well, the motherboard is lifted up, and there's actually some insulation and air ducts guiding air behind the motherboard. That squirrel cage fan pulls air from the front up the back. There are some heat pipes and a heat sink or two back there for chipsets that have been, I think, reversed and put on the other side of the motherboard. Pulls it out and pushes it out the back. Yeah, that's some advanced cooling. You might also notice there's a component missing. What could possibly be missing here? The power supply. Where is it? It's down in this area. The whole lower section is a long 1,000 watt power supply. It has small 60 millimeters or so fans on the front, and they're thick, so they got a lot of static pressure, and some out the back. That's where the power supply is, which is a weak point in one area. This thing, if you haven't guessed it or didn't know, is liquid cooled from the factory. That's right, the G5 Quad came only liquid cooled. There was no air cooled version of it. So here are the front fans. Let's pull those out, which you can. There's a little guide notch here. And look at these monsters. These are very substantial fans. Seem almost like more like propellers for water than they are fans. I'm not sure what the exact ratings on these for static pressure are, but I would imagine it must be pretty good with those terrifying fins. So yeah, use my pinky here to try to jostle one. This big fan module just pops out. It uses, this is the plug it uses. So we have more view of the RAM. So if you ever wanted to change out the RAM, you just yank that and you're good to go. 16 gigs. 16 gigs for a late 2005 machine, which is what this is. The Quad came out late 2005, I think in October. 16 gigs of RAM is incredibly impressive. Then again, 16 gigs of RAM still is plenty. 8 gigs of RAM right now is starting to become, I think, the standard, maybe between 6 and 8. 16 is still in the probably don't need it level. Now, forgive the heatsink. This was blown out before I started using the machine, but it's collected again. You can see all the fins and whatnot. This cover, if I try to pull it out, it actually breaks a rivet somewhere up here, which was used, I think, for Apple to make sure you weren't digging too deeply into the machine. So I'm not going to do that, but it is a large, fairly thick radiator, pump system, and then of course those other heat sinks for the VRMs up here and fans to pull that heat through. So it's a very impressive cooling system for a machine that presumably was quite powerful. I say presumably because the only head-to-head things I've seen were from Apple themselves and for the older models. The older model was not fighting against the last of the Pentium 4s. It was fighting against like mid-Pentium 4. So it looked like Northwood with a 533 megahertz front side bus. This machine uses a 1.25 gigahertz front side bus, something that no Pentium 4 based architecture would surpass. It was only until the later Core 2 series, when they went to 1333, did they have a higher system bandwidth. So these machines were impressive. The ones running at 2 gigahertz probably ran at a 1 gigahertz front side bus, even though I think Steve Jobs did say 1.25 just because they were capable of it. Those ones seem to do pretty well. This one is only 500 megahertz faster, but of course more cache, more cores. The reason Apple moved away from the G5 and PowerPC architecture seemed to be, at least from my reading of it, that IBM and I guess Motorola as well, because they were both working on these sort of things, were not able to bump clock speeds and performance high enough. And so Steve Jobs, I guess, saw, and probably others in Apple saw that Intel was making good strides, decided to switch over, which I think has been unfortunate. Apple used PowerPC for a long time. It's a different architecture. It's RISC rather than x86. And this machine still can pull off some things that I think are impressive. For such an old machine, running at such a low clock speed to still be usable online with a modern browser, I think is pretty impressive. But they're hot. These chips, one complaint against them, and the reason why they never made it into the laptop scene, is because they were built from a server design, IBM's power architecture servers, and I think they came on CPU cards, for crying out loud. Adapting them to laptops, they were just by default power guzzlers. Their chipsets were power guzzlers. They would require a whole lot of work. That's why the G4 continued into service. It just languished, being refined slowly, though its process node I don't think ever dropped below 90 nanometers. That's why it kept being shoved into the laptops, with the climax being the 1.67 gigahertz G4 processor, just because the G5 was too power hungry for it. I think if I was Apple, I would have tried to stay with the power architecture for longer, more backwards compatibility and whatnot, though clearly Apple doesn't care about backwards compatibility. I mean, on this machine there are no legacy ports at all. I would have given IBM a chance. Now, you could say that Steve Jobs already did. IBM said they'd get up to 3 gigahertz, and they never did during the time they were together. The most they did was 2.7 gigahertz in two dual single CPUs. Though that machine was fairly, I think, unstable. It was just a bit too much. Oh well, that's my rant there. I think the PowerPC architecture is interesting. I think this machine is pretty interesting and just beautiful looking. I mean, it's nice blue PCB. There's heat sinks covering everything. It's just a very nice looking machine, inside and out. And the different cooling zones for power supply, processor and RAM, expansion cards, and spinning media, I think it's really cool. And The reason I'm starting with this machine is that this will lead into, I think, my discussion on the BTX form factor, which this machine isn't officially, but it reminds me of it because it's, if you've noticed, the machine, that's the front, it's laying on the wrong side for a traditional PC to have the case side open. So I'll talk about BTX in a later video, and then the Dell XPS 720 later one. So let's get this thing back together, hooked back up, and let's play around with some video editing to see what it's like. One thing I forgot to mention is that these fans are held into their shroud mounting mechanism using rubber pull-throughs, just like what Noctua ships with their fans to reduce vibration. These little thoughts that Apple put into this machine that make it so impressive in my mind. There's just been a whole lot of effort put into it. Every little thing has been thought about. And clearly it's expandable. You can switch out, you can add more RAM, you can switch out the graphics card, you can put in more expansion cards, you can change out hard drives, you could probably change out that optical drive if you needed to, and it's just very well cooled. You can't do anything with the power supply, of course. It's nothing like when we think of modern Apple products where you can't change anything. You know, Mac Minis that are sealed from the bottom, iMacs where there's a slot for RAM maybe, and that's about it. An impressive machine. The original graphics card to come with this PowerMac G5 when I purchased it was this NVIDIA 7800 GT. This is a traditional single slot card and is probably the second most powerful card you can put on this machine if you don't count flashing cards. See, the 4500 Quadro, FX 4500, is the fastest card that you can put in the PowerMac G5 without any ROM flashing. If you put the 7800 GTX in here and flashed it to an FX Quadro, you could do that. There was an ATI Radeon 1900 that if you flash with the open firmware IBM style ROM rather than EFI ROM, you get it to work. So when I bought this, I knew I was going to upgrade it to the best card, which would be the Quadro in my case. But I didn't realize, because I wasn't paying much attention to that, all I cared was for a good condition PowerMac G5 Quad, was that this actually came with probably one of the best graphics cards it could. And you'll also notice that it comes with this support bracket, kind of workstation style, since the G5 Quad, by all means, is designed as a workstation. Of course, it has the spare power cable on it. Not a bad card. The design is a bit goofy in that it pulls air from the rear and pushes it towards the front, which means that the airflow system in the G5 is going to be trying to push that air back again, so there's going to be some recirculation. For the Mac edition of this card, they should have switched the cooler around at the very least, I think. The original keyboard that came with this PowerMac G5 is, well, it's not the best. It's a rubber dome keyboard. I believe it's age appropriate to when this machine came out. The keyboard itself is, of course, a bit grungy from the previous owner, but the keystrokes feel a bit just gritty anyway, which I think is just part of the design. It has a see-through acrylic base and a USB hub. I wanted something a little better, especially if this is going to be, a regularly used workstation machine, and upgraded to a mechanical keyboard. This is the Matias. Let me look at the model on the back, because I always forget. The Matias Tactile Pro 4 keyboard. It has some acrylic foot kickstands, which make it really seem age appropriate for this machine. But it's a mechanical keyboard using Alps switches. USB there, and USB there. The same types of switches that I think the old extended keyboards use. So the old beige ones. It's been a good keyboard so far. However, I will note that a lot of the media keys don't seem to work. The eject button for the optical drive does. My guess is this was probably designed thinking more about more modern versions of OS 10. Power Mac G5s and a number of G4s max out at 10.5.8 Leopard, which is pretty old by now. So that's probably why those don't work, but for the most part, it works just fine. And who really cares about volume control on the keyboard when you're using real speakers anyway? If I was using the internal speaker, yes, that would make sense. All right, we're going to fire the machine up. Here we go. So the bong, of course, happened. Now, I've noticed that with these types of machines, it takes a little while for it to end up sending a signal to the monitor, probably because it's doing its own power on self-test. But I will meet you once we get to the desktop. Alright, so here we are at the desktop using just the standard background. I'm going to fire up Final Cut Pro, and then we'll play around a bit. All right, here we are in Final Cut Pro 6. This is a part of Final Cut Studio 2. Now, at the beginning of this video, I said I would answer the question, which I'm sure has popped into some of your heads, as to why in the world I decided to use this ancient machine as an editing machine, as opposed to, say, a more modern computer like one I do own. Well, the first part of that question involves me justifying getting a Power Mac G5. Ever since I saw some Drawaga videos on the Power Mac G5, I wanted it. It's a fantastic looking machine. It's just really neat. It's water cooled from the factory. It's a dual processor machine, which I find fascinating. That's why I like the dual Pentium Pro machine so much. It's neat, so I wanted it. Okay, now that I have it, what am I going to do with it? It's not a gamer. Now, there are certainly some games that were released for it, which I'm going to try to get so I can do some comparisons. Age of Empires 3 came out for Mac during this era. So it wasn't for any of those. It actually became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Why did I turn it into an editing machine? Because that's what people said that Macs are good for. And now I was reasonable enough to understand that simply saying that they're good at that doesn't necessarily make them good at that. But what I did know is that, well, if they were frequently used for that, and if they were decent at benchmarks in editing in their time back when these were new, then there should be a lot of good software available. I was able to find a giant box set of Final Cut Studio 2. It is a heavy box full of big manuals and whatnot for $50 on eBay. I can't really complain. And it is multi-threaded. This thing, when it's rendering, actually peaks at usually around 75% CPU usage, and rendering takes a long time on this machine. I'm not going to, like a 40-minute machine, like this video here that I'm in, which was probably the IBM 5170 upgrades video. Probably took over 24 hours to render, and then took over 24 hours to upload. Just how big it is. So yeah, and I use a simple edit. So it's not fast by any means, but it is working with 1080p, 60 frames a second video. And so I'll show you my editing process. I think I'll open a new file, new project, and we'll just get something opened up. All right, to show some of the editing process, I just pulled in some clips that I've used, usually the more gags that I throw in my videos. So we'll pull one in. The middle, if you haven't used Final Cut Pro, at least the older versions, I'm not sure how the newer ones work, you have over in this section, you have all your clips and all your different, different projects open at the same time in different tabs. This is the clip you're working on, getting it ready to pull in to the timeline, and this is the kind of preview for the timeline itself. So here we have a clip from SpongeBob. Now in this sort of scenario, actually let me move to something with some visuals to it.
The most important tool is respect.
All right, so now the thing is with these clips, once they are a high enough bit rate, so let me open up a more intensive video file. All right, so I pulled in a clip from one of my previous videos with IBM.
This is the RAM.
And I'll turn the volume down. You'll notice that it's a bit choppy. Okay? And that's just the way this program works with PowerMac G5 architecture with such a high resolution video. That these machines weren't really built thinking 1080p was going to be the norm. So the way I will usually edit is I call it auditory editing. I basically try to find visually where I've stopped or started and start there, and then I'll listen for things and make my cuts there and check whether or not the video lines up properly. And then I puts when the video clip starts, O makes it end, spacebar can start and stop, and once I've gotten my section ready, so it's a short little clip here, I can drag it in. And so the default sequence settings are assuming 720p at 60 frames a second because I couldn't find one for 1080p 60 frames a second. But the program knows what type of clip I'm putting in here, and so then adapts the program for it. If we ever watch it, now the audio hasn't been rendered yet, you'll notice how choppily this bar goes. So just watch that. It's skipping over. However, if we go to a lower resolution section of film, so let's look at this footage, look how smoothly it moves. Over time, while I'm editing, so I'll have multiple clips in here, so we'll just keep dragging more down, whatever. Over time, when I'm going through and going back and playing, because I'm looking for moments to put in a joke or a visual aid or something, the audio will even begin to cut out. And all I'm trying to do is find where I need to put some information. So let's say in this clip, it's short, I was playing through and I heard that I said something that would be a good idea for a joke or I needed to put in a visual aid. Well, if I press spacebar, there's a delay between when it stops normally, especially on a long clip. So I have to keep stopping, going back, and then narrowing down where I think I heard it. Once I find it, I can then pull in whatever it is that I wanted to do. So let's lock that down and say we needed to put that joke starting there. So editing, now for you, those of you with more powerful machines and more modern editing software, you probably said, wow, this sounds like a bit of a pain. Yeah, it's a bit of a struggle at times. Once it gets bad enough, so this is the point where audio is starting to cut out and I can't really follow along the timeline, I will usually save the project and restart the program. I've done some things to help make that process prolong how long I can use the program. One of the settings in user preferences is having audio playback down to low. There are a few others that help too. It should be in system settings, setting the memory usage for application, just max it out, which is about only 2.5 gigs, and the still cache 2.5 gigs. This thing doesn't seem to want to use more than 4 gigs of RAM. As far as playback control, video quality, a low to help things go through smoother. And there's one other section here that has helped dramatically. Alright, if you open sequence and then settings, you get this screen. And this screen gives you a few options. So in QuickTime video settings, which pertains to the playback here, it seems, going from 100% and dropping it significantly down does seem to help. Now it could be a placebo effect, but by dropping that, I've noticed that the whole program seems to run a little better when I'm trying to scrub through and find where I need to add edits and cuts and whatnot. As you can probably guess, the key to doing well in this type of editing scenario where I have a machine that's essentially struggling to work with 1080p video is making my cuts up here with the individual clips as good as possible before I drag anything down. I've also noticed, and it could be because I don't know how to use the program properly, that let's say I'm adding in a bunch of clips and then I decide, oops, oh, I wanted to put something in the middle here. Trying to insert things, it tends to start clipping off ends of the other things. So it's very much a edit in the order you go in scenario for myself. So that's a little bit of me using QuickTime on this machine. If I pull up the if I pulled up the task manager, you see that's using very little RAM. This thing doesn't need 16 gigs for my usage for video editing. I don't ever see this machine using any higher than probably 2 or 3 gigs of RAM at any time, even when I'm doing a full load with lots of clips piled up and sound and whatnot. It doesn't do a whole lot. So that's that. So on this machine, I did actually get, there's of course chess which comes with it, but there are a couple of games that were online that I was able to download. One's Bit Fighter, and one's Mars Explorer. So let's take a peek at Bit Fighter. We'll host a game. Play with robots? Yes. Minimum players? Okay. I don't even remember how to play. Oh, there we go. It's using WASD. It's actually not a bad looking game. I'm just not very good at it. So this is one thing that the PowerMac G5 can do. So let's look at the Mars rover one. Sorry, it's called Mars Explorer. Yeah, there's a new version. Your name, we'll do 1, 2, 3, 4. So there's usually a few games in here, but most of them seem to be dead. But let's see if I can get into any of these. Game could not be connected to. Yeah, so we'll just do host a game. Let's do that. The soundtrack is a bit irritating in that it's not very long and just kind of repeats. And right now I think I have the video quality set to max to stress the machine, which actually makes it a bit choppy. If you turn it down a bit to something reasonable, it's not too bad. So yeah. Oh, well this is different. Oh, okay. Yeah, it's a bit wonky. So it looks like in this particular map, it gives us something like wings to play with. Anywho, you can also shoot, and you can switch into tanks and other things. Yeah, the graphics, when you turn them up, it doesn't look much different. It's just, well, just stresses the machine a lot. And in fact, I can hear either the CPU fans or the graphics card fans speeding up with a low frame rate of hitting as low as 7 frames a second. So yeah, that's that game. Alright, so I hope you've enjoyed this look at the PowerMac G5. Once I get more actual games for the machine, I would like to show you. This machine, even though it has its problems, its quirks as far as struggling through editing 1080p video, it is an enjoyable machine to use. I do find it quite impressive. The built-in speaker really isn't that bad, and we are able to use the internet. However, it's not worth really showing because it's just using an internet browser. YouTube is still a struggle for these machines, even with 10.4 Fox and providing AltiVec acceleration. Actually, why don't I just show you? It still is a struggle. I think it can sometimes chug through 720p video, just if it's a lower bit rate. Otherwise, you have to use either download it and play it with a media player, or use a QuickTime enabler. All right, so this guy, he's on the Retro Machines group, and so we'll go to his video here. So let's see how well it plays.
My story with classical music started when I was about...
All right, so right now it's starting at 480p. Let's see what happens when we go to 1080.
Years old, and
you'll notice that audio's gotten choppy. The video has pretty much stopped, even though it had in fact buffered to that point. So let's try 720p.
LP. It was Carbon conducting the...
All right, so it's already gotten choppy. We've sort of lost the signal here.
Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra.
It likes to freeze. 480p was fine. One way to fix this is by right-clicking a second time. You can actually open it in QuickTime, using QuickTime Enabler, if the video is encoded properly. So 1080p,
started when I was about 5 years old.
It's now nice and smooth. I hope he doesn't mind me using his video very briefly. You should go watch his channel. So it's Andre Campana Maritica. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. Forgive me, but he has good stuff, and he's on the Retro Machines group. So that is one way to do it. Another way is by opening up a different application. The application is called Core Player. It took me a while to remember it. I don't have Core Player on the G5 because it's rather unnecessary. Using QuickTime Enabler, I'm able to play whatever I want. However, if you're using a weaker G5, let's say you get an old single core 1.6, or you're using some sort of G4, QuickTime Enabler, even once you download the video, once you open it up in QuickTime, QuickTime, there's a lot of complaints about it from this era, at the very least, not being very efficient. It will still struggle and be choppy. My PowerBook G4 has a hard time with anything above 480p, even in QuickTime. But Core Player can do 1080p. It's a fantastic program. So I would say look for Core Player. PowerPC Hub talked about it. You should be able to play almost whatever video you want. All right. So I hope you've enjoyed my quick look at the G5. 10.4 Fox is easy to find and easy to use. It's basically just Firefox with PowerPC optimization. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Like and subscribe if you want to see more. And definitely leave me a comment below. Is there something you wanted to see in particular? If there's any improvements you'd like to see done, just tell me. These are great machines. If you can find one cheap and good shape, I'd say jump on it. It's a neat piece of history. It's not super old yet, but it's the last of the G5s. It's the most powerful G5 to exist, and mine pretty well is the top of the line, as powerful as you can make this machine be without doing advanced things like flashing ROMs and whatnot. So I hope you've enjoyed that, and stick around, because after this we're going to look at BTX, and then after we look at BTX we're going to look at what I'm dubbing the anti-Power Mac G5, the Dell XPS 700 series. And it will make sense once I get there, but it's a bit of a build-up. And a long-term goal, I do wish to build an anti-Power Mac G5, which will be a dual processor system. And the goal for that one will be NetBurst. Because NetBurst, the Pentium 4 and the G5 were from the same time and kind of had the same idea. longer pipelines to boost clock speeds. The Pentium 4, of course, is a more extreme case. The G5 wasn't as bad in that respect, but they both had that idea: we need to boost clock speeds. The Pentium 4 succeeded in that it got pretty high. The G5, I mean, if we look at the last G4 on the desktop being 1.44, the G5 did get up to 2.5 gigahertz, which is, a decent jump, but it's nothing compared to the Pentium 3 in the 1 gigahertz realm, jumping up all the way to, in the final stages, 3.8 gigahertz with the Pentium 4. Anyway, those are projects down the line. I hope you've enjoyed it, and take care. Happy Memorial Day weekend. This video will probably come out after that, but I hope it was enjoyable, and that your local veterans or whatnot, you gave them something special, usually your time, especially if they're in your family. Older folks usually don't get visited very well, and a lot of the older men in our society probably were in the military. World War II veterans are getting older, so they're kind of dying out, but they sacrificed, or were willing to sacrifice themselves, and they're, of course, the Vietnam and Korea veterans. Anyway, I will talk to you later. I hope you have a great day.